She was the answer to a prayer he never dared to speak, and he was the anchor for a soul lost at sea. This is the story of a love that bloomed in the hard-packed earth of rejection, proving that some hearts, like seasoned wood, are strongest where they have been broken. Redemption Gulch, Montana Territory. Autumn, 1888. The air, sharp with the promise of an early snow, carried the scent of pine smoke and cold iron. It was a place built on second chances and last resorts, a truth that clung to the dust on the unpainted buildings and settled in the lines on the faces of its people. The afternoon stagecoach, a rattling cage of wood and worn leather, bucked to a halt in the center of town, its arrival the day's only real event. A few idle men leaning against the general store porch straightened up, their eyes narrowed with lazy curiosity. From the dark interior of the coach, a woman emerged. She did not step down so much as descend, a slow and deliberate movement, as if every joint ached with the memory of the 1,000 miles she had crossed. Her name was Elara. She wore a traveling cloak of indeterminate gray, faded and patched but scrupulously clean. Beneath it, a simple woolen dress spoke of practicality, not vanity. Her face, framed by hair the color of ash and silver pulled back in a severe bun, was a map of a life lived without ease. She was 42 years old, and in a world that valued women for their youth and their hands, she knew she possessed only one of those currencies. In her gloved hands, she clutched a small, battered valise that held everything she owned in the world. Across the street, a man detached himself from the front of the saloon. This was Bartholomew Finch. He was a man whose prosperity was loud. It was in the shine of his boots, the cut of his city-bought coat, the glint of the gold watch chain stretched across his ample stomach. He was the man who had sent for her, his letter promising a respectable life as the wife of a man of means. He strode toward her, his expression a ledger of expectation. As he drew closer, his confident stride faltered. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her from the worn toes of her boots to the weary lines around her eyes. A sneer, ugly and immediate, twisted his lips. The town was watching. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snort of a tired horse and the sigh of the wind. "Well, now," Finch's voice boomed, thick with derision and meant for all to hear. "What is this?" The advertisement promised a bride, not a grandmother. Elara flinched as if struck, but her chin remained high. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over his shoulder, a defense she had perfected over years of enduring quiet cruelties. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. "I am Elara," she said, her voice low and raspy from disuse. Finch laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're old," he declared, stabbing a finger in her direction. "Look at you. Worn out. I sent good money for passage. I paid for a wife who can run a house and give me sons, not a relic to put on the mantelpiece." The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. The whispers started among the onlookers, a rustle of pity and cruel amusement. From the deep shadows of the livery stable across the way, another man watched. Silas Blackwood. He was younger than Finch by a decade, but his eyes held the ancient stillness of the mountains that loomed over the valley. A jagged scar, a pale lightning bolt against his tanned skin, ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a day when the world had tried to tear him apart. He saw not a worn-out woman, but a straightness in her spine that defied the crushing weight of Finch's words. He saw the pride in the set of her jaw. He saw a survivor. Finch, enjoying his audience, reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. He tossed them into the dust at Elara's feet. "There," he spat. "For your trouble. Find a room somewhere until the next stage passes through. You're no use to me." He turned on his heel and strode back toward the saloon, a king dismissing a peasant. Elara stood frozen, a statue of quiet disgrace in the middle of Redemption Gulch. The coins glinted in the dirt, a final, glittering insult. The townsfolk began to drift away, the show over. She was alone. Her entire future, the fragile hope she had nurtured across a continent, had just been snuffed out in a gust of public scorn. The wind picked up, whipping her grey cloak around her ankles. She did not move. And then, a shadow fell over her. She did not look up, bracing for another blow, another jeer. But there was only silence. Finally, she lifted her gaze to see Silas Blackwood standing before her. He did not look at her with pity. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers directly. He said nothing. He simply bent down, his movement slow and deliberate, and picked up the coins from the dust. He straightened, wiped them clean on his trouser leg, and held them out to her, his calloused palm open. It was not a handout. It was a restoration of dignity. Her hand trembled as she took them. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but weighted. Silas looked past her, at the vast, indifferent landscape, then back to her face. He saw the tremor in her chin she was fighting to control. He saw the fierce pride that refused to be extinguished. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, as solid as the granite of the nearby peaks. "The nights are cold," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an overture of pity. "I have a cabin. It's empty." He gestured with his head, a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the edge of town, where the wild land began. "No one will bother you there." He did not offer his home, not yet. He offered a space, a boundary, a place to simply be. Ilara's mind raced. In her experience, kindness from a man was merely a down payment on a debt she would be expected to pay later. She looked from his scarred face to the leering doorway of the saloon where Finch had disappeared, then to the curious, whispering faces that still lingered at a distance. She had no money for a room, no allies, nothing but the worn cloak on her back and the shame burning in her chest. She looked back at Silas. His gaze was level, asking nothing. He was simply waiting for her answer, patient as a season. She gave a single, stiff nod. It was the smallest movement, but it felt like shifting the weight of a mountain. He said nothing more. He turned and began to walk, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, a small, grey ship in the wake of a silent tugboat. His ranch was a half-mile from town, nestled against a stand of old-growth pines. It was a simple, functional place. A sturdy, one-story log house stood beside a large barn, both built with clear, competent hands. A little ways off, set apart from the main buildings, was a small cabin, barely more than a single room. It was this cabin he led her to. The door opened onto a clean, Spartan space. A narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small cast-iron stove, a table, and a single chair. It was more than she could have hoped for. "Wood is stacked by the door," Silas said, his voice filling the small room. "There's water in the pail. I'll bring supplies from the general store." He stood in the doorway, a large silhouette against the fading light, careful not to cross the threshold, not to invade the space he had just given her. She stood by the table, her valise still clutched in her hand. "Why?" The word was a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. It was the first question she had asked of her new reality. Silas considered it for a moment, his gaze on the rough-hewn timbers of the wall. "No one should be left in the dust," he said finally. And with that, he turned and left, pulling the door gently closed behind him. The slow-burn rhythm of their lives began. It was a communication conducted without words, a language of gesture and provision. Each morning, Ilara would find a tin plate on her small porch stoop, 2 eggs, a slice of bacon, and a thick piece of bread. In the evening, a bowl of stew, still warm. She never saw him leave it. She would only see his broad back disappearing toward the barn in the early dawn or the deep twilight. In return, she began to assert her own presence. She swept the porch until it was spotless. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin and, using a sharpened stick and her bare hands, began to turn the soil, coaxing a few stubborn, late-season herbs from the ground. One afternoon, she found one of his work shirts slung over a fence post, torn at the elbow. She took it inside. By the firelight of her small stove, her nimble fingers, a skill no one could deny her, worked a neat, nearly invisible mend into the thick fabric. The next morning, she left the folded, repaired shirt on the railing of his porch. When she peeked out her window an hour later, it was gone. He said nothing. But the next day, beside her morning plate, was a small bar of lye soap and a length of fine, strong thread. The silent conversation continued. He fixed the loose stone on her front step. She took the pail of well water she found each morning and used it to scrub the cabin's single window until it gleamed. He left a stack of old newspapers and a book of poems on her stoop. She used the papers to insulate the cracks in the walls and read the poems by firelight until her eyes grew heavy. They existed in separate orbits that circled a common sun of unspoken understanding. Weeks passed. The first snow fell, a soft, white blanket that muffled the world and made the small ranch feel like the only place on earth. The quiet was profound. Ilara found that the silence she had once used as a shield was transforming. Here, it was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was the peace of being left alone but not being abandoned. One morning, she woke to the sound of chopping. It was earlier than usual. She looked out her window to see Silas splitting wood with a powerful, rhythmic grace. His coat was off despite the cold, steam rising from his shoulders. He worked with a focused intensity that she recognized. It was the same focus she applied to her mending, her cleaning, her gardening. It was the focus of a person who found solace in work, in making things right. As he turned to stack a load of wood, his eyes met hers through the window pane. This time, she did not look away. He stopped, his arms full of logs. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. She responded with a small nod of her own. In that shared glance, a wall crumbled. It was not a foundation, but it was the first stone removed from a fortress that had stood for a lifetime. Winter seized the land, holding it tight in a fist of ice and wind. The days grew short, the nights impossibly long. The world shrank to the dimensions of Silas's ranch, a small pocket of warmth and life against a vast, frozen emptiness. The blizzard arrived without warning, a furious white wall that descended from the mountains and swallowed the sky. The wind screamed like a tormented spirit, rattling the little cabin on its foundations. Ilara stoked her small stove, but the cold seeped through the walls, a persistent, invasive chill. She sat wrapped in her quilt, listening to the storm's fury, feeling a familiar loneliness creep back into her heart. A loud knock on the door made her jump. It was a solid, commanding sound, not the timid rap of a stranger. She opened it a crack to find Silas standing on her porch, his shoulders and hat already thick with snow. The wind tore at him, whipping his coat around him. "The storm is bad," he said, his words nearly snatched away by the gale. "My fire is stronger." It was not a request, but a statement of care. He was not inviting her into his home so much as ordering her out of the cold. She hesitated for only a second. The image of him nodding at her through the window pane, the memory of the thread and the book of poems, the steady provision of food and wood, it had all been building toward this moment of trust. She grabbed her cloak and stepped out into the swirling maelstrom, pulling the cabin door shut behind her. The short walk to his main house felt like a trek across a polar wasteland. He shielded her from the worst of the wind with his own body, one hand resting lightly on her back to guide her. The main house was like him, solid, unadorned, and built to last. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall, a massive fire roaring within it, throwing dancing shadows across the room. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, the faint, clean scent of his lye soap. He led her to a worn armchair near the hearth and handed her a tin mug of steaming coffee. He took a seat opposite her, and for a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle within. It was the warmth, the safety, the shared quiet in the face of the tempest, that finally unlatched a door deep inside her. "He said I was used goods," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost part of the fire's whisper. Silas did not respond, but his gaze, fixed on the flames, shifted slightly, a sign that he was listening with his entire being. She started to speak, the words coming in a slow, halting trickle at first, then flowing into a steady, quiet stream. She told him of her first husband, a charming man who had left her with nothing but his name and a mountain of debt. She told him of the years of thankless work as a seamstress, her fingers raw, her reputation sullied by the shadow of her late husband's failures. "I wasn't just too old for Mr. Finch," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I was poor. I had no family to speak for me. I was a problem to be solved. His advertisement wasn't for a wife. It was for an acquisition. She spoke of the hope she had carried with her on the stagecoach, a fragile, desperate thing. The hope of a home, of a life where she would not be invisible, where her worth would not be measured by what a man could extract from her. She had been running not just toward a new life, but away from the slow death of being utterly alone and forgotten. When she finished, a profound quiet settled over the room. The only sound was the howl of the wind, now seeming more distant, less menacing. Silas finally stirred. He lifted his hand and slowly, unconsciously, touched the jagged scar on his face. "Grizzly," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Fall of 82. My younger brother, Caleb. We were tracking a stray bull." He paused, his eyes seeing a memory in the fire. "The bear came out of the brush. Fast. It went for him." His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. "I was there. But I wasn't fast enough to stop it from. I got between them. Drove it off." "But Caleb?" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The story was carved not just on his face, but in the permanent winter in his eyes. His scar was not a mark of violence endured, but of a protection that had come a moment too late. It was a monument to his own private failure, his own ghost. Elara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the stoic rancher. She saw a man who understood loss. A man who knew the weight of things left unsaid and undone. His pain was different from hers, but it came from the same deep well of human sorrow. He was not just a protector, he was a fellow survivor, marked by the world in his own way. She reached out, her hand hovering in the warm air between them for a moment, before she let it fall back into her lap. But the gesture was enough. "I am sorry for your brother," she whispered. He met her gaze across the firelight, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his stormy eyes. Not pity. Not sorrow. It was recognition. "I'm sorry you were left in the dust," he replied, echoing his first words to her. In the heart of the storm, within the sanctuary of his home, two scarred souls had finally shown each other their wounds. And in that shared vulnerability, a bond stronger than any timber or stone began to form. The blizzard broke, leaving the world pristine and silent under a heavy shroud of white. As the seasons turned, so did the tenor of life on the ranch. Spring arrived not as a gentle thaw, but as a fierce, determined bursting of life. The creek swelled, the grasses turned a vibrant green, and the air filled with the smell of damp earth and new beginnings. Elara, too, was undergoing a transformation. The timid, grey ghost who had arrived in autumn was gone. In her place was a woman grounded in the rhythms of the land. The small herb patch behind her cabin had been tilled and expanded, its neat rows a testament to her patient labor. She moved with a quiet confidence, her posture straight, her hands, though calloused and stained with soil, always busy. She had found a purpose not given to her by a man, but one she had cultivated herself. They still lived in their separate dwellings, but the space between the main house and the cabin had shrunk. They often worked in comfortable silence near each other, he mending a harness, she weeding her garden. Sometimes a rare, brief conversation would bloom. He would comment on the weather. She would ask about a newborn calf. Each exchange was a small, sturdy brick laid in the foundation of their connection. This quiet peace, however, was a fragile thing in a world that did not like loose ends. One bright May afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not the slow, ambling gait of a neighbor, but the arrogant, purposeful clip-clop of a man on a mission. As the rider drew closer, Ilara's blood ran cold. It was Bartholomew Finch. He reined in his expensive horse at the edge of her garden, his gaze sweeping across the scene with possessive disdain. He saw the flourishing rows of vegetables, the smoke curling from the cabin chimney, and Ilara herself, standing with a trowel in her hand, her face healthier, her eyes clearer than he remembered. His pride, a petty and venomous thing, was stung. He had discarded her, but he could not stand the thought that his refuse had been claimed and polished by another. "Well, well," he drawled, swinging down from his horse. "The old bird has found a new nest. I heard whispers in town. didn't believe them. He advanced on her, his shadow falling over her neat rows of letters. This is a cozy arrangement. But let's not forget who paid for your passage to this territory. You have a debt to me. Elara stood her ground, her knuckles white around the handle of the trowel. I owe you nothing, Mr. Finch, he laughed. That's not how I see it. You belong to me until your debt is paid. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. You'll show some respect. The sentence was cut short. Silas was suddenly there. He had come from the barn, moving with a terrifying silence, his presence as abrupt and absolute as a rock slide. He did not waste time with threats or shouts. He simply placed his large, calloused hand over Finch's, his fingers closing around the man's knuckles with the force of a vice. Let her go, Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it held a chilling finality, the sound of immense pressure being applied. Finch's arrogant expression curdled into one of shock, then pain. He looked from the crushing grip on his hand to the cold fury in Silas's eyes, the eyes of a man who had faced down a grizzly and won. This was not the kind of fight Finch understood. This was not about bluster or money, it was about something primal and unyielding. Finch's grip on Elara slackened. But this was no longer just Silas's fight. In that moment, Elara found the voice she had been nurturing all winter. She yanked her arm free, not as a victim escaping, but as a queen dismissing a subject. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Silas, and met Finch's gaze head-on. Her voice was level, clear, and carried across the yard with the authority of a judge's gavel. You own nothing here, she said. Not the land, not the man, as not me. I am not a debt to be collected. I am a woman who has chosen her home. Now leave this place and do not return. It was a declaration of independence, spoken with the unshakable strength of a person who finally knew her own worth. The combined force of her righteous anger and Silas's silent, immovable power was too much for a bully like Finch. He was defeated, not by violence, but by their unified spirit. He stammered, sputtering empty threats about lawyers and the law, but the words were hollow. He scrambled back onto his horse, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, and galloped away, a cloud of dust his only parting shot. The yard fell silent. The afternoon sun beat down, warming the soil. The confrontation, so sudden and violent, had passed as quickly as a summer storm. Elara stood breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly receding. Silas remained behind her, a silent, steady wall of support. He had not fought for her. He had stood with her, allowing her the space to fight for herself. The dust from Finch's hasty retreat settled back onto the earth. The air, which had been charged with tension, grew still and quiet, amplifying the hum of a bee in the garden and the distant lowing of cattle. Elara's hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the raw power of the words she had finally spoken aloud. Silas had not moved. He was a sentinel at her back, a silent testament to the battle just won. He looked not at her, but at her garden, at the life she had coaxed from the stubborn soil. He saw the trowel still clutched in her hand, an emblem of her resilience. Her strength wasn't in weapons or words of fury, but in her capacity to nurture and to build. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the small workshop that stood beside the barn. Elara watched him go, a knot of uncertainty tightening in her chest. The threat was gone, but the future remained an unwritten page. What now? The unspoken thing that had grown between them in the silences and the shared glances now demanded a voice. He was gone for several minutes. When he emerged, he walked back to her, his stride as deliberate as ever. His hands, which she had seen gentle newborn lambs and splinter-seasoned logs with equal ease, were cupped together, concealing something. He stopped in front of her. The sun caught the silver in her hair and illuminated the deep lines of peace that were beginning to etch themselves around his eyes. He slowly uncupped his hands. Resting in his palm was a small bird, carved from a piece of pale pinewood. It was exquisitely simple, its line smooth and flowing, the grain of the wood polished to a soft sheen by his touch. It was not a perfect anatomical specimen, but a representation of spirit, of something small, resilient, and capable of flight. He held it out to her. His gaze did not waver. "This is a home," he said, his voice quiet but profound. "If you want it, it was not a proposal of marriage in the conventional sense, not a contract or an obligation. It was an offering. A choice." He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, the freedom to decide her own belonging. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but these were not the tears of shame or sorrow she had known for so long. They were tears of overwhelming, unhoped-for grace. She looked from the small, perfect bird in his palm to his face, at the scar that she no longer saw as a mark of tragedy, but as a symbol of his deep, protective heart. Slowly, she reached out and took the wooden bird. Its surface was warm and smooth against her skin. It felt solid, real. Then, she did something that bridged the last remaining distance between them. She reached out her other hand, the one that was not holding the bird, and gently, reverently, she traced the pale, jagged line of his scar with her fingertip. It was an act of profound intimacy, an acceptance of his history, his pain, and his strength. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. "I am home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It was her answer. It was her vow. Later that day, she went into her small cabin and took out the faded, grey traveling cloak that had been her shield and her shame upon her arrival. She carried it to the main house, to his house, their house. With the same steady hands that tended her garden, she took up a pair of shears and began to cut the worn fabric into neat squares. She would not discard this piece of her past. She would transform it. Over the next week, she sewed the squares together, creating simple, dignified curtains for the windows of the main house. The fabric that had once symbolized her lonely, desperate journey now framed their view of the world, filtering the morning sun, a constant reminder that even the deepest shadows could be remade into something that holds the light. The epilogue of their story was not written in dramatic events, but in the quiet, steady passage of seasons. Years turned into decades. The redemption gulch of Finch's casual cruelty faded into memory, replaced by a growing town where the Blackwood Ranch was known not just for its fine cattle, but for its unshakable decency. Silas and Ilara grew old together, the love between them deepening like the channel of a river, quiet on the surface but with a powerful, constant current beneath. Their hair turned the color of winter snow, and the lines on their faces spoke not of hardship, but of shared laughter and peaceful sunsets. The small garden patch behind the cabin expanded year after year, eventually becoming a sprawling, flourishing market garden. Ilara, with Silas's quiet help, developed a reputation throughout the territory for her hardy vegetables and vibrant flowers, her hand always finding life in the earth. People would travel for days to buy her seeds and ask her advice, and she would give it freely, her voice calm and confident. They never had children of their own blood, but their home became a sanctuary. The little cabin where Ilara had first found shelter was never left empty for long. It became a haven for those the world had cast aside, a young woman fleeing a brutal husband, a drifter with honest eyes but no prospects, an orphan boy found sleeping in their barn. Each found a warm fire, a plate of food, and the silent, unwavering acceptance of Silas and Ilara Blackwood. Their legacy was not one of wealth or dynasty, but of compassion. It was a legacy of mended shirts and shared meals, of offering shelter without asking for anything in return. It was built on the simple principle Silas had stated that first day, no one should be left in the dust. On a warm summer evening, in the twilight of their lives, they sat together on the porch swing Silas had built, their hands intertwined. His was still a map of scars and calluses, hers still stained with the good earth. They watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. As always, they needed few words. Their shared history was a comfortable silence between them. Inside, on the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace, sat the small wooden bird Silas had carved so many years ago. It was dark with age, its surface polished smooth by decades of dusting and the occasional, tender touch of their fingers. It was the sentinel of their story, a permanent reminder that a home is not a place you are given, but a choice you are brave enough to make. He was her anchor. She was his answered prayer. And together, they had built a life that was more beautiful and enduring than either of them could have ever dreamed, a quiet testament to the extraordinary power of a love that sees, a love that waits, and a love that, against all odds, chooses to bloom. In a world that often judges by the cover, by the year of print, or the wear on the binding, Silas and Alara's story reminds us that true worth lies within the pages. It is a story of seeing past the scars to find the soul, a testament to the fact that it is never too late to find where you belong. True love doesn't demand perfection, it finds beauty in a life that has been fully lived. If this story of resilience and quiet love moved you, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that find the light in the shadows. Thank you for listening.